Happy New Year, Foundry. We did it. We made it. We survived 2021. Maybe it's a little bit dramatic for me to say survived, but this year for me, and I know for a lot of people, was completely exhausting. I spent most of 2020 longing to get back to my real life and to my loved ones. And then I spent 2021 exhausted by that very thing, and by good things. It wasn't just things that I typically find draining or like busy work or things I don't want to do. It was actually shocking to me to find out how diminished my capacity was for the people I love the most and for the work that I find most meaningful. And in the midst of that level of tiredness, every few months in 2021, I was just rocked personally by like loss of loved ones or tragedy. And the combination of that is that I am so tired. I'm the most tired I've ever been. My bones hurt, my skin hurts, my hair hurts. My word for this past year is exhaustion. But the silver lining for being so tired is that I'm like low-key obsessed with the idea of rest, the concept of rest. That would be my word for 2022 if we're picking words for a year, or maybe like a phrase, the phrase, the rest that is truly rest. Because something I also found out about rest is there's a lot of things that are masquerading as rest that didn't actually bring me rest this past year. I feel like at some point I tried all of them and they left me listless and jumpy and just overall depleted instead of well rested. And instead of embarrassing myself by listing all those things, I want to read a couple verses to you instead that describe a very different picture of rest. Jeremiah 6:16 says this. This is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. And then Psalm 23, you may have heard this a million times. I know I have, but these verses hit so differently this past year. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. So interesting to me how Psalm 23 describes rest. It's not inactivity. It's green pastures and still waters. It's food and drink for our souls. It's this rest that nourishes us so that we can get back up and get back to the things that we love to do and need to do. When I read these words, I feel this like longing in my bones, this like hunger in my bones for this kind of rest. I need this kind of rest. But another thing I've noticed is like, have you ever like looked at how different people feel rested by different things? I found this year it like so like surprising to me that one of the most nourishing things I did besides like get 8 hours of sleep at night, which I don't think anything beats that. But second best for me would be leaving my laundry pile to like literally pile up to waist height level and then spending an hour and a half folding it while listening to like a podcast or a sermon. I was so nourished by that I would actually like strategically plan my life, like my week and my laundry schedule around it so I could have that time. But that's not something that would nourish Jake at all. Like in no way would that feed my husband's soul. I think it's really important for each of us to take the time to figure out what forms of rest actually feed our soul and then structure our lives around it. Because it's really different for everyone. But there is one thing that I feel is like nearly universally true about rest that I learned this past year. And it's don't wait until you're dead tired and depleted to go looking for true rest. I found again and again that when I'm drained and weak, I will reach for the thing that's easiest over the thing that's nourishing and restorative. When I'm dead tired and hungry, it is a million times easier to open a bag of flaming hot Cheetos and call it dinner than it is to like prepare a nutritious meal. If I'm dead tired and I'm bored, it's so much easier for me to reach for my phone and just mindlessly scroll instead of try to do something creative or a hobby. Things that research actually say are more relaxing than scrolling on your phone. This last one is a big one. If you're dead tired and depleted and you're lonely, it's so much easier to isolate and to try to take care of things yourself than it is to reach out and be vulnerable and take those risky steps to connect and to have the intimacy that we want so much, that we desire so much, that we're created for in community. I have found again and again that if I'm tired and depleted when I go looking for rest, that I will choose the path of least resistance, not the ancient paths that Jeremiah 6 talks about, not the paths of righteousness that Psalm 23 talks about, but the path of least resistance. And they almost always leave me malnourished, and then over time can kind of compound the exhaustion that I was trying to alleviate to begin with. I think I'll end with this. There's a natural ebb and flow to our energy levels, and we don't have to be ashamed of that. We don't even have to fight it. We can work with it. We can use the time of higher energy in our day and our week and our month to prepare for the times that we know we're going to be drained. Maybe that means, trying to find out which therapist is covered by your insurance right now instead of waiting till you feel like you're drowning to go do that work. Maybe it means calling someone and making a plan now instead of waiting until you're tired and you're depleted and you're lonely. And finally, we don't have to figure this stuff out on our own. Psalm 23 says there's a shepherd who will guide us, who will lead us into those righteous paths that bring us that rest that restores our soul. So I think we should take, maybe we could just try right now to take, 30, 60 seconds to think about the things that actually have brought you rest. And maybe conversely to think about the things that you find yourself reaching for when you're tired and hungry and lonely, and that actually don't satisfy. They actually leave you in worse shape. Let's just think about that, and then we'll pray and ask the Lord to lead us to the rest that restores our souls. Lord, help me figure out what feeds my soul. Help me to walk in the paths that lead me there instead of the paths that leave me more tired and hungry and lonely, Lord. Even as it feels like the outside of us is falling apart and wasting away, Lord, you've promised that you can renew us inwardly day by day, over and over. And that as we follow you, we'll find rest for our souls. Lord, please lead us in these paths. We ask in your name. Amen.
Happy New Year, Foundry. My word for us today to think about is process. Every year, there's a process that we employ after decorating our house for Christmas of getting everything back put away, getting out the things that we had to tuck away, to put out the Christmas things. And if we don't do that process with a level of intention, it could be, it could be the spring before some of these things get tucked away. The journey for us, a lot of us, is that we want our circumstances to be different in 22. We want our feelings to be different in 22. But the scriptures call us to the pathway to that is to process those thoughts and feelings and those experiences in a way that would prevent us from projecting them. Devastating things that are processed before God that we can carry well or differently, not as those who have no hope, even though we might be grieving. That we can carry our successes from 2021 in a way that doesn't lead to be puffed up with pride, or that blinds us to where every perfect and good gift came from. What we don't process, we will project. And so you've been through some things this year, things that have made you glad, things that have made you sad, things that have made you scared, things that have made you angry. Romans 2 tells us to not be conforming to the pattern of the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, which is not just rejecting this argument or that argument, but rather bringing our whole self before God and letting it be transformed by the process of God's intimacy. The Psalms show us the emotional roller coaster. 1 minute, God, you're awesome. God, you're wonderful. The next minute, God, where are you? That's part of process, to bring our full self before God and to let ourselves be transformed. That begins when we are willing to enter and deal with the things that we're mad about, the things that we're sad about, the things that we're fearful of, and the things that we're thankful for. So let's enter that process trusting that the one who began this good work in us will be faithful to complete it, and that we don't have to project unprocessed thoughts and feelings into 2022, that we can bring those things before God and let the love of God encourage and challenge our hearts. So let's do that together now. Let's enter a few seconds where we just bring to the surface, what are we mad about? What are we sad about? What are we fearful of? And what are we thankful for?
Romans 12 has always been one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, but recently verse 2 has been especially convicting to me, where it says, "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Being transformed by the renewing of my mind. I have always heard about taking thoughts captive. Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians 10:5, when he says, "We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." So I've heard this, but I've never really understood why we would do this. The rest of verse 2 in Romans 12 actually tells us why, when he says, "Then you'll be able to test and approve what is God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." And for me, this is not only what I want, but this is telling me that it's actually possible to do. COVID has been a really challenging season for everybody. And for me, the re-entry into life back after COVID has been actually the most challenging. My life looks completely different than it did at the new year of 2020. I now have 2 kids in school. I have a new baby, new health goals, and a lot more fear than I've ever had before. I can often feel myself sinking into this toxic thinking and spiraling out of control. So for 2022, I've decided to begin the hard and lifelong discipline of figuring out what it means to take my thoughts captive. I just no longer want to feel like I'm a victim to my thoughts or to my mind. Jenny Allen says in her book, Get Out of Your Head, that we can interrupt every single negative thought with one phrase, and that's, "I have a choice." It's scientifically proven that when we think new thoughts, our brain is actually physically altered and the neural connections in our brains can change. So what we think about, our brains can actually become. The Bible supports this as well. Romans 8:5 says, "Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, and those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit." So when I'm spiraling because of noise or distraction, which is constant in a very full house, I can stop my brain and make the choice to find God and create a moment of stillness. When I'm spiraling in isolation, I have a choice to shift my mind back to God and seek out friendship and community. When I'm spiraling in anxiety, I have a choice to shift my mind back to God through remembering what he's done and remembering his good and his sovereign power. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." I've always been a big fan of journaling, and for me, that feels like a good first step in this process. So with journaling, meditation, friendship, counseling, I'm aiming to start this discipline of learning what it means to take my thoughts captive for 2022. For the next period of time, I encourage you to get a piece of paper and pen and just first try to just sit in the stillness and the silence. Close your eyes, take deep breaths or focus on your breaths. If your mind starts to wander to your to-do list or your anxieties or any other wandering thought, just try to think the phrase, "I have a choice," and choose to interrupt that thought with stillness or a truth from God. And if that's still proving to be hard, which I understand, just write that thought down on the piece of paper. Then you can come back to it. You know that it's out there, and you can empty it from your brain and return back to the stillness. Psalm 39 says, "O Lord, you've searched me and know me. You know when I sit and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. Where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence?"
Past 2 years, we have been living in a state of isolation, not complete and total isolation, but a separation from a lot of the infrastructure and the social circles that we found ourselves in before COVID. For many of us, the relationships that we have greatly just shrunk down into smaller groups of people, a more manageable amount of people to interact with, given everything that's been happening. For some, that has looked like maybe just even shrinking down to our immediate family and maybe a few friends on top of that. We have been working remotely, missing family gatherings. We've been told not to shake hands, not to hug one another, not to touch one another. And many of us are just lonely. So a question that I'm asking myself, that I encourage you to ask yourself this year as we are going into 2022, is how can we have intimate relationships with one another? Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. The word intimacy sounds kind of strange, applied to something other than a significant other. But this term definitely applies to significant others, but is so much more than just that. Intimacy is closeness and togetherness. It is affinity and familiarity, companionship. None of these are solely characterizing a significant other relationship, but rather they very much apply to Platonic relationships. In fact, Jesus, we read in the Bible, is never married. And yet he has these intimate relationships, these intimate conversations, these intimate moments with several disciples and others. And in fact, Jesus says in the book of John that greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. Friendship was very important to Jesus. This new year, we may have the temptation to make goals and to make them only about our mental health or our spiritual health or our physical health. And while all of those are very, very important, I think we all should consider possibly setting goals in terms of our relationships. Not necessarily in the form of significant others, but rather in finding intimate friendships. On this topic, Wesley Hill says that God never meant us to be purely spiritual creatures. That is why he uses material things like conversations, shared meals, trips, hugs, small kindnesses, and gifts between friends to enrich the new life he gives us. We may think that this is rather crude or unspiritual, but God does not. He invented human relationships. He likes friendship. He invented it. And what I would add to this quote by Wesley Hill is that it's not just human relationships that God invented, but the concept of relationships in general. I mean, it is expressed in his very nature as a triune God, the Holy Spirit and Jesus and God, that they together have an intimacy in a relationship. This new year, I'm going to challenge you and myself to ask the question and to consider, who in our lives can we pursue intimacy with? Where am I going to move beyond just the surface level conversations and develop a relationship that is deep and invested? Who can you ask to be intimate and platonic and committed in your friendship, in your relationship? Where do you need to foster a relationship with someone that maybe is incredibly different than you, for the sake of relationship and for the sake of conversation, for the sake of learning, not for conversion? Who do you need to hug this year, or invite into your home, or cry with, or laugh with? Who needs to be a part of your family? As we read in the book of Proverbs, a friend's love extends to all times, and a friend sticks closer than siblings. Let us be intentional this year about developing intimate, platonic friendships. And to do this, I'm going to invite you to take a minute and to consider who you need to pursue with this intimacy and this friendship this next year.